He was born with his face trapped in silence. No drawing showed what he felt, until the new nanny held his hand and, in a simple gesture, changed everything. When the millionaire father saw the scene, time stopped, because there, the impossible had just happened. The silence in the Upper East Side penthouse had a physical weight, an almost palpable presence that settled on the Italian designer furniture and the cold marble floors. Outside, the New York City sky wore its usual shade of overcast gray, a watercolor of heavy clouds that seemed to mirror the atmosphere inside the apartment. Amid the vastness of the playroom, an almost imperceptible sound broke the quiet, the hesitant drag of a colored pencil across a sheet of paper. Leo, a boy of just 6, was trying with painful concentration to give shape to a face. It was his mother's face, an image that was fading in his memory like an old photograph, but one he refused to let go. The right side of his own face, immobile from a paralysis that medicine still couldn't fully explain, made the act of expression a battle. Each stroke was a small victory against the muscles that wouldn't obey him, a silent scream trapped in a body that felt like a cage. His father, Richard, a man whose fortune multiplied every second with the fluctuations of the stock market, watched the scene from a distance, leaning against the doorframe. His impeccably tailored suit contrasted with the disarray of his soul. He was a master at managing his portfolio, at turning capital into more profit, but he was a complete novice in the art of mending a broken heart, especially his own son's. Guilt was his constant companion, a liability on his emotional balance sheet that no amount of dollars could reverse. He worked too much, spoke too little, and the mirrored walls of his home only reflected the figure of a lonely man. The hermetic routine of that house, however, was about to be altered. Clara crossed the imposing iron gate, feeling her heart pound, a mixture of fear and hope. Coming from Queens, her eyes carried the strength of someone who had faced many storms, and the faith of one who believes the sun will always shine again. The job was more than a salary. It was the chance to support her younger siblings, and, maybe one day, resume the early childhood education degree that necessity had forced her to abandon. The reception was as cold as the marble beneath her feet. Richard sized her up with a look that seemed to calculate her market value and find the result unsatisfactory. "My son doesn't need pity," he said, his voice low and sharp as a razor's edge. "He needs routine and discipline. You'll be paid on time. Your duties are in the binder on the table." He didn't wait for a reply, just turned and left, leaving behind the echo of his words and the subtle scent of expensive cologne. Clara took a deep breath, swallowing the humiliation. She needed this money. Upon entering the playroom, her gaze met the small figure of Leo, frozen before the incomplete drawing. The boy wasn't crying, but the frustration in his eyes was so eloquent that something inside her broke. Silently, she approached and sat on the soft rug beside him. She didn't say a word. She just watched the small, trembling hand holding the pencil, the tip hovering over the paper, unable to complete the curve of a smile. Delicately, as if touching something sacred, she reached out and covered his hand with hers. Together, her fingers guiding his, they traced an uncertain line, a simple, wavering arc, a smile. At that exact moment, Richard, who had returned to retrieve a forgotten briefcase, stopped outside the room. The door was ajar, and he witnessed the scene. He saw the pencil glide across the paper, not with the precision of an artist, but with the fluidity of something being set free. And then he saw what money, the best doctors, and years of therapy couldn't buy. A fleeting glimmer, a tiny spark of light in his son's hitherto vacant eyes. He stood motionless, his body rigid, his breath caught in his chest, unable to comprehend how such a simple gesture could have touched what his immense wealth never could. The next day, Richard sat in his office, a sanctuary of glass and steel overlooking the pulsating city. But the computer screen before him, displaying investment charts and cryptocurrency fluctuations, couldn't hold his attention. The image of Clara's hand on his son's was etched in his mind, a simple scene that destabilized the cold logic upon which he had built his life and his immense fortune. When he heard the soft chime of the doorbell, indicating the nanny's arrival, he felt an inexplicable discomfort, a resistance to this new force invading his controlled universe. Clara, for her part, entered the house with a renewed purpose. In her bag, besides her simple lunch, she carried a small portable speaker. With the tacit permission of the silence, she turned it on at a low volume, and a soft, classical melody filled the air, chasing away the ghosts that seemed to live in the corners of the room. Leo, who was waiting for her on the same rug, looked up, his head tilting slightly, like a bird hearing a new sound. She didn't force an interaction. Instead, she took out a sheet of colorful window clings and, with a smile, began to stick them on the immense floor-to-ceiling window. A yellow sun, a smiling cloud, a tree with red apples. "Look, Leo," she said, her voice calm. "It's gray outside, but in here we can have our own sun." Richard, watching on one of the security cameras that dotted the house, frowned. This wasn't in the protocol. The routine was about schedules, about therapy, about structured activities, not about decals on his expensive windows. But he didn't intervene. He continued to watch, a mixture of irritation and curiosity eroding his certainty. The music continued, and with it, Clara's voice, narrating simple stories about the pictures, about the colors, about a puppy she had as a child. Leo didn't respond with words, but his eyes followed her. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't seem lost in his own world. During the afternoon, while they were assembling a puzzle, Clara made a funny face, imitating a fish. A sound escaped Leo. It wasn't a laugh, but a puff of air, a spasm of joy that moved the functional corner of his mouth, creating a crooked, imperfect smile that, for the father watching from afar, was absolutely staggering. All his assets, his entire net worth, were not worth the glimpse of that expression. The gratitude he felt was overwhelming, but it came with a shadow, a pang of jealousy, sharp and shameful. Why could she? Why could a stranger with her soft music and cheap window clings reach his son in a way that he, with all his power and love, never could? Her presence was a constant reminder of his own failure. At the end of the day, a heavy rain fell over the city, and the sound of thunder made Leo flinch. Richard hadn't arrived yet. Stuck in a meeting about acquiring new assets, Clara acted on instinct. She grabbed sheets and pillows and built a small fort in the middle of the living room. "Don't be afraid," she whispered, guiding him inside. "This is our fort. No thunder can get us in here." Inside, under the yellow glow of a flashlight, she began to tell a story about a brave boy who befriended the stars. Leo was calm, his eyes fixed on her face, mesmerized. He raised his small, trembling hand and touched Clara's cheek. His lips moved, trying to form a sound. "An," he tried, frustration clouding his gaze. "It's okay, sweetie," she encouraged gently. "You can say it?" He took a deep breath, concentrating all his strength on that single effort. "Auntie." The word came out clearly, a small, acoustic miracle in the silence of the house. At that exact moment, Richard entered the apartment, his expensive coat soaked with rain. He stopped in the hallway, hearing that single word echo, a word that was not "Dad." And what appeared on his face was not joy, but the cold mask of a deep and unexpected shock. The following morning was born cold and formal. The gentle melody that had filled the house the day before was replaced by a heavy silence, the same one Clara had found when she first arrived. Richard was home, but he moved like a ghost in his own fortress. his shoulders tense beneath the expensive fabric of his shirt. He didn't say good morning. He simply gestured with his head that he wanted her in his office. The space was the heart of his empire, where he commanded his business and multiplied a fortune that seemed infinite. Clara entered, feeling small and out of place among the mahogany shelves and the panoramic view of the city. Richard stood with his back to her, watching the flow of traffic below like a general studying a map. "Sit down," he ordered, without turning. His voice was devoid of any emotion. He finally turned, and his eyes were like two chips of ice. "There will be some changes to Leo's routine. From today on, I want the activities to be strictly those on the schedule. No improvising, no distractions." He paused, choosing his words like someone selecting stocks. "And he is not to leave the apartment. For any reason, the park is out of the question." Clara felt a knot form in her stomach. "Mr. Hayes, with all due respect, Leo has shown so much progress. A little fresh air, seeing other children, it would do him a world of good." "What's good for him is what I determine." He cut her off, his voice rising a notch. "I am his father. I'm the one who pays the best specialists and who understands his needs. Your job is to execute my orders, not question them. Your salary is for doing as I say." The word salary was spoken with an emphasis that put her back in her place, that of a mere employee, a replaceable part in the machinery of that house. She swallowed hard and nodded, with no strength to argue against such a high wall. The rest of the morning dragged on. The light in Leo's eyes seemed to have faded again. He sensed the tension in the air, the absence of music, Clara's forced smile. He refused to play with the window clings, pushing the sheet away. The joy of the previous day seemed like a distant memory from another life. At lunchtime, the crisis set in. Leo's favorite dish, mashed potatoes with shredded chicken, was placed before him. He looked at the food, then at Clara, and with a slow, deliberate movement, pushed the plate to the center of the table. He crossed his little arms and shook his head, his lips sealed shut. "Leo, you need to eat." "Sweetie," Clara tried, her voice full of a sweetness that barely concealed her anguish. "Just a little bit." He shook his head again, more firmly this time. A single, silent tear rolled down his face, the only part of him that moved with complete freedom. After half an hour of frustrated attempts, Clara gave up. Her heart aching, she went to the office. "Mr. Hayes, I'm sorry to bother you, but Leo won't eat. He's refusing." Richard stood up, impatience marking his face. He marched to the dining room, the sound of his expensive shoes echoing on the marble. He saw the untouched plate, his son with his arms crossed, his face stained by the dried tear. He didn't bend down, didn't offer a word of comfort. His gaze passed over the boy and fixed on Clara, cold, hard, and accusing. The gratitude from before had turned to suspicion. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice low and laden with a contained anger, as if she, and not the boy's pain, were to blame for this silent rebellion. Richard's accusation hung in the air, as cold and heavy as the drizzle that was beginning to wet the window panes. Clara felt the impact of those words like a punch to the gut, but she lifted her chin, her dignity the only armor she possessed. "I didn't do anything, Mr. Hayes," she replied, her voice firm but without a hint of defiance. "He's just sad. Children can feel when things change." The use of the word sad seemed to offend him even more. For him, sadness was a variable that should be eliminated, a liability on his emotional balance sheet that he didn't know how to zero out. He dismissed her with an impatient wave and approached his son. He tried a different approach, the one he used to close his biggest deals, authority and reward. "Leo, you will eat now," he said, his voice hard. The boy didn't even look at him. "If you eat everything, I'll buy you that new slot car racing set you saw in the catalog." Silence. The offer of a material good, which for Richard was the solution to almost everything, had no effect. His son's silent refusal was more powerful than any shouted no. For 2 weeks, the house became a silent battlefield. The routine imposed by Richard was followed to the letter, turning the days into a succession of grey, mechanical hours. Clara did her job with a painful professionalism, caring for Leo, but without the freedom to offer him the affection he so desperately needed. The music was banned, the window clings removed, and the stories replaced with speech therapy exercises. Leo, in turn, continued his protest. He ate the bare minimum to survive, just enough to avoid a trip to the hospital, but he grew thinner, and the light in his eyes faded with each passing day. Richard buried himself in work, closing million-dollar deals, increasing his fortune in euros and dollars. But every night he returned to a home that grew colder, quieter. He saw the reflection of his failure in his son's eyes, and by association, in the face of the nanny who witnessed his defeat. He knew, deep down, that she was the key, but his pride and jealousy were insurmountable guards around his heart. On a particularly oppressive afternoon, as Clara was unsuccessfully trying to fit pieces of an educational game with Leo in the living room, the boy suddenly stood up. His movements were slow, but filled with a determination that startled her. He didn't head toward his room or the kitchen. He began to walk down the long, silent hallway that led to a wing of the penthouse she had never visited. Clara froze. She knew instinctively where he was going. There was a door at the end of that hallway that was always closed. When she had asked the cook about the room, and the answer came in a frightened whisper, "That's the madam's room. No one goes in there. Ever." Clara's heart raced. "Leo, wait! Where are you going?" she called, her voice low, trying not to alert Richard, who was on a call in his office. But Leo didn't stop. It was as if an invisible force was pulling him in that direction. He stopped in front of the dark wooden door and, on tiptoe, stretched his small, trembling hand toward the golden doorknob. By the time Clara reached him, the door was already creaking open, revealing a room steeped in shadows, where a veil of grief seemed to cover every object. A scent of jasmine and gardenia still lingered in the air, like a memory that refused to die. Leo took a step inside, his eyes wide, fixed on a large, unfinished painting on an easel. At that exact moment, the office door flew open with violence. Richard appeared in the hallway, his face pale with fury. "What are you doing in here?" he yelled, his voice tearing through the silence like thunder, and the sound was not just of anger, but of a deep, ancient pain, suddenly desecrated. Richard's shout ricocheted off the hallway walls, a shockwave that made the air vibrate. Leo, who until that moment had been mesmerized by the unfinished portrait of his mother, flinched as if he'd been struck. His eyes, once curious, filled with a panic Clara had never seen. The small hand that was touching the canvas retracted, and he clung to her leg, his body trembling uncontrollably. The fury on Richard's face was terrifying. It was the fury of a man watching his last safe harbor being invaded. He controlled a vast portfolio of stocks, monitored the cash flow of dozens of companies, and understood the complex dance of the capital markets. But here, in this hallway, he had lost control of his most precious asset. "I gave a clear order," he snarled, advancing toward them. "This place is forbidden. What were you thinking, bringing him here?" He wasn't looking at his son. His rage was focused entirely on Clara, the agent of chaos in his ordered universe. In that instant, something inside her shifted. Fear gave way to a fierce, protective instinct, a strength she didn't know she possessed. She knelt, wrapping her arms around Leo, and physically placed herself between the boy and his father. He came on his own. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "I was right behind him." "That's no excuse," he retorted, his face contorted. But the boy's crying, which had started low and restrained, erupted into a desperate sob, a sound the house hadn't heard in years. Leo clutched Clara's dress, his face hidden in her lap, his small body racked with spasms of pure terror. It was the sound of his son's cry that finally pierced Richard's armor. Clara looked up at him, and there was no accusation in her eyes. only a sad plea. "You're scaring him," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Please, just look at him." The sentence, spoken with devastating simplicity, hit Richard with full force. He stopped, his fists clenched at his sides. His gaze finally dropped from Clara's face to the small, huddled figure on the floor. And then he saw it. He saw the terror in the trembling shoulders, heard the pain in the muffled sobs. It wasn't disobedience, it was fear. It was the fear he himself was causing. The anger dissipated like smoke, leaving only the bitter residue of shame. That room was the sanctuary of his grief, the place where he kept his wife's memory untouched, like a sacred treasure. Seeing his son there, with the nanny, had felt like a profanation. But now, seeing Leo's reaction, he realized the true sacrilege was his shout, his blind fury. He, who had built a monumental inheritance for his son, was in that moment destroying his small heart. Without another word, Richard turned and walked back to his office, his steps heavy and uncertain. He closed the door behind him, not with the force of anger, but with the quiet of defeat. The silence that followed was deeper and more crushing than the scream. Clara remained on the floor, cradling the boy, whispering words of comfort in his ear. "Shh, it's over, sweetie, it's over. Everything is okay." Gradually, Leo's sobs subsided, turning into small gasps. He didn't let go of Clara, but he lifted his tear-streaked face and pointed to the painting. "Mommy," he whispered, the word a breath of pain. In his office, Richard sat in his leather chair but didn't look at the screens flashing with real-time quotes. He opened a drawer and took out a small photo of his wife, smiling on a sunny day. He looked at the woman he loved, and then on the monitor displaying the security camera feeds. He saw the scene in the hallway. He saw the nanny, whom he had treated with such coldness, holding his son with a tenderness he himself was incapable of offering. The next day began with an uncomfortable quiet. The echo of Richard's shout still seemed to linger in the air, an invisible presence that made every gesture and word heavy. Clara arrived with a knot of apprehension in her throat, unsure if she still had a job. To her surprise, it was Richard himself who opened the door. He wasn't wearing his usual suit, but casual slacks and a cotton shirt, which was in itself a disconcerting break from protocol. His eyes, usually cold and distant, carried the weight of a sleepless night. "Good morning, Clara," he said, his voice low, almost inaudible. "Can we talk for a minute?" He led her to the living room, not the office, and motioned to the sofa. Leo was still asleep. The simple act of sitting in the same space, not as boss and employee, but as two adults, was unprecedented. "I wanted to apologize," he began, the words sounding foreign in his mouth. "For my behavior yesterday. I shouldn't have yelled. Not at you, and especially not at my son." He looked at his own hands, clasped between his knees, as if confessing a major investment failure, a miscalculation that had compromised all his capital. "That room, it's a difficult place for me, but that doesn't justify what I did." Clara just nodded, sensing the sincerity in his voice. She didn't need a grand speech. That simple request, coming from such a proud man, was worth more than any explanation. Later that evening, as Clara was preparing to leave, Richard intercepted her in the hallway. "Clara, wait." He looked nervous, a state she never imagined seeing him in. "I was thinking, I know it's short notice, but would you and Leo like to have dinner with me? Here at home. Fatima, our cook, can prepare something." The proposal caught her completely by surprise. An invitation to dinner. The line separating the professional from the personal was blurring, and that scared her. She was the nanny, the employee. Accepting could be misinterpreted. But then, she thought of Leo. She thought of what it would be like for him to see his father and his auntie sharing a meal like a normal family. I'd love to, Mr. Hayes," she accepted, her voice a little shaky. The dining table, usually an imposing and lonely piece of furniture, was set for three. Silverware gleamed on perfectly folded linen napkins. The formality was still present, but something had changed. There was an attempt, a visible effort from Richard to build a bridge across the chasm that separated them. The conversation started hesitantly. They talked about the weather, about what Leo had learned in therapy. But then Leo, sitting in his special high chair, picked up a piece of broccoli and, with a mischievous grin, flung it in his father's direction. The small green projectile landed with a soft thud on Richard's pristine white shirt. There was a second of tense silence. Clara held her breath, expecting an explosion. But instead, Richard looked down at the stain on his shirt, then at his son, and a strange sound escaped his lips. A laugh. It wasn't a loud or expansive laugh, but a genuine sound, rusty from disuse, that surprised everyone, including himself. Seeing his father's reaction, Leo let out a small squeal of delight. The ice was broken. Clara laughed too, a relieved and contagious laugh. For the first time, they weren't the employer, the nanny, and the child with special needs. They were just three people sharing a meal and a moment of lightness. Between the reflections in the crystal glasses and the shine of the silverware, something new began to form. A glimpse of connection, a quiet and unexpected attraction that manifested in the glances that met over the boy's head. It was something fragile and dangerous, like a high-risk investment, and they both knew it. But in that moment, amid the shared laughter, they allowed themselves to feel the warmth of that small emotional profit, ignoring the risks that lay ahead. The weeks following the dinner were like the first days of a timid spring. The house, once a mausoleum of marble and echoes, began to breathe again. Richard started coming home from the office earlier, trading the last hours of analyzing dividends and interest on his investments for the chance to hear the end of a story Clara was telling Leo. Small rituals were established. The boy now waited for his father at the door, and together, the three of them would assemble a puzzle in the living room before bed. The closeness between Richard and Clara grew silently, in exchanged glances, in discreet smiles. It was an unknown and dangerous territory for both of them. But the happiness they saw on Leo's face was a powerful argument against any kind of fear. However, the world outside that penthouse was not so understanding. The elite private school where Leo was enrolled was a microcosm of the society to which Richard belonged, a place where appearances were worth more than any genuine feeling. The headmistress, Mrs. Vance, a woman of regal posture and a smile that never reached her eyes, observed the new dynamic with growing disapproval. On a sunny morning, during a small book fair in the school's courtyard, she witnessed a scene that, to her, confirmed all her suspicions. Richard bent down to speak to Leo, and Clara instinctively reached out and straightened the collar of his shirt, which was rumpled. It was a quick, almost imperceptible gesture, filled with a domesticity that didn't fit the employer-employee relationship. The grateful smile Richard gave her sealed the verdict in the headmistress's eyes. The whispers started the next day, spreading through the hallways and in the mothers' group chats. "Did you see the nanny for Richard Hayes's son? So familiar," said one. "He seems like a different man, but it's not appropriate. For the family's image, you know," commented another. The story became distorted, taking on malicious undertones. Concern for the image of one of the city's wealthiest families became the main topic. The pressure soon reached Richard. It was during a business lunch that one of the school fathers, an important partner in one of his investment funds, brought it up. "Richard, my friend," he began with false cordiality, "people are talking about your domestic situation. You know how our world works. Reputation is a valuable asset. Sometimes certain decisions, no matter how harmless they seem, can affect business." The veiled threat was crystal clear. His fortune, his position, Everything he had built was being questioned because of a feeling he barely dared to name. Richard felt a chill run down his spine. He was a master at calculating risks, at protecting his capital, and public perception was the pillar of his empire. He resisted for a few days, his heart at war with his mind, but the cold logic that had made him a billionaire won. He convinced himself it was to protect Leo from the gossip, to preserve his wife's legacy. That night, he called Clara into his office. The door closed with a definitive click. He stood behind his immense desk, a barrier between them. "Clara, I'll be direct," he began, his voice devoid of any emotion. The same tone he used to announce the end of a contract. "Your employment here is terminated. It was an administrative decision, aimed at Leo's well-being and the preservation of our family's image." He pushed an envelope across the desk. "Here is a very generous severance package, more than enough for you to start over." Clara stood frozen, the words hitting her with the force of a slap. There was no anger on her face, only a deep, silent pain, the pain of betrayal. She didn't touch the envelope. She just turned and left. The next day, Leo woke up and the first word he said was "Auntie." Richard, his heart in pieces, tried to explain that Clara wouldn't be coming anymore. The boy didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just looked at him with a lack of comprehension that was worse than any accusation. He ran to his room, and Richard heard a sound that broke him inside. The sound of paper being torn, violently and repeatedly. When he entered the room, he saw Leo on the floor, and surrounding him were the pieces of his mother's drawing, the one they had finally been managing to finish together. The days following Clara's dismissal were a descent back into the abyss. The house didn't just return to silence, it sank into a different kind of silence, one haunted by the memory of sound, of music, of laughter. Richard tried to fill the void with the only thing he knew: control. He hired a new nanny, an educator with an impeccable resume and references from prominent families. She was efficient, punctual, and completely unable to reach Leo. The boy treated her with a cold indifference, as if she were just another piece of expensive, useless furniture in the landscape of his loneliness. He had retreated into an impenetrable shell. The few words he had begun to babble disappeared. Food once again became a battlefield, but the most painful thing was his fixation on the pieces of the torn drawing. He kept them in a small box and would spend hours spreading them on the rug, staring at the broken lines of his mother's face, as if trying to decipher an impossible puzzle. Richard, meanwhile, threw himself into work with a desperate ferocity. His office screens glowed with the high returns of his stocks and the rising value of his bitcoins, but the numbers had lost their power to soothe him. The profit flowing into his accounts couldn't offset the emotional liability growing in his chest. He tried to convince himself that he had done the right thing, a strategic decision to protect his most important assets, his reputation and his son's future. But every night, returning home to the same scene, the boy on the floor, the paper fragments, the accusatory silence, his certainty unraveled, revealing the stark truth of his mistake. He saw Clara's ghost in every corner, in the almost invisible mark on the window where the sun cling had been, in the empty space at the dining table, in the echo of a soft melody his mind insisted on playing. He dreamed of her. They weren't romantic dreams, but dreams of a torturous simplicity. He saw her sitting on the floor, guiding Leo's hand. He heard her telling a story about stars, and he would wake up with a sense of loss so profound that it left him breathless. The envelope of money, which he had imagined as a gesture of generosity, now felt like an insult, a pathetic attempt to quantify the unquantifiable. On a Saturday morning, the new nanny called him, her voice laced with professional frustration. "Mr. Hayes, I don't know what else to do. He won't let me near him. He just stays with those pieces of paper." Richard went to his son's room and found him in the same position as always. He knelt, the expensive fabric of his pants creasing on the rug. "Leo," he began, his voice hoarse. Let's put this away. We can buy a new sketchbook, new pencils. You can make a brand new drawing." Leo looked at him, and for the first time in days, there was an expression on his face. It wasn't anger, nor sadness. It was a cold, adult-like contempt that Richard had never imagined seeing in a child's eyes. Slowly, Leo gathered the paper pieces, put them back in the box, and hugged it to his chest, as if protecting the last valuable thing in the world. That look was the breaking point. Richard stood up and walked to his office, feeling like a complete failure. He, the multi-millionaire who understood cash flow and high-risk investments, had made the worst trade of his life. He had exchanged the soul of his home for an empty image. He had to fix it. But how? The arrogance with which he had fired her now turned against him. He didn't have her address, didn't have a relative's phone number. In his haste to erase all traces of her, he had deleted her number from his cell phone. He had access to any information money could buy. But the most vital piece of all, how to find Clara, seemed beyond his reach. He opened his desk drawer, looking for her file, the hiring paperwork. It wasn't there. And then he remembered, with a chill, that he had told his assistant to shred all her records, to close the matter. He was utterly alone with his monumental mistake. The search for Clara became Richard's new obsession. A man accustomed to having the world at his feet, to getting any information with a single phone call, found himself facing a frustrating challenge. The employment agency that had recommended her politely informed him that they couldn't provide personal data of former candidates. He hired a private investigator, one of the best in the city, but the information he had was vague. A first name, Clara, and a generic description, New York City, with its millions of inhabitants, was an ocean, and he was searching for a single drop of water. While the fruitless search unfolded, the situation at home worsened. The new nanny, feeling unable to cope with Leo's mutism and hostility, resigned. Richard found himself alone with his son, forced to cancel important meetings and manage his business empire remotely, between failed attempts to get the boy to eat or communicate. The mornings were the hardest. It was time to take Leo to school. The car ride was spent in a heavy silence. At the school entrance, he saw the curious stares of the other parents, heard the whispers that ceased when he approached. The image he had worked so hard to preserve was, ironically, more tarnished than ever. Now he wasn't just the reclusive widower, but the father who couldn't control his own son, the man who changed nannies like he changed ties. On one of those mornings, fate, or perhaps desperation, offered him a clue. Stopped at a traffic light a few blocks from the school, he saw a familiar face on the sidewalk. It was Fatima, the cook, who had taken a few days off to visit family. She was chatting animatedly with a young woman. Richard didn't hesitate. He parked the car haphazardly and ran to them, the honking of other drivers sounding like a soundtrack to his desperation. "Fatima," he called out, slightly out of breath. The cook turned, surprised. "Mr. Hayes, what are you doing here?" "Fatima, I need your help," he said, getting straight to the point. "Do you have Clara's contact info? An address? Anything?" Fatima frowned, suspicion in her eyes. She liked Clara and hadn't understood the sudden dismissal. "Why do you want to know? You fired her." "I know. And it was the biggest mistake of my life," he admitted, the vulnerability in his voice disarming the cook. "Leo, he's not well. He needs her. I need her." Seeing the genuine anguish in her employer's eyes, Fatima's loyalty was torn. She shook her head. "I don't have her address, sir, but I know the neighborhood in Queens where her sister lives. She used to talk about it sometimes." It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was a direction, a thread of hope. He thanked her profusely and for the first time in weeks felt a spark of optimism. That same afternoon, leaving Leo with Fatima, who agreed to come back early, Richard drove his luxury car toward the outer borough. The wide, tree-lined streets of the Upper East Side gave way to a labyrinth of narrow streets and modest houses. The contrast between his world of wealth and the reality of this place was stark. He felt like a stranger, an intruder. After getting lost several times and asking for directions from people who looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, he found the street Fatima had mentioned. He parked the car, which looked like a spaceship that had landed on another planet, and began to walk, his heart pounding. That's when he saw her. Clara was coming out of a small house with a rusted gate, carrying a grocery bag. She was thinner, and there was a shadow of sadness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She wore simple clothes, her hair tied back carelessly. When she looked up and saw him standing there in the middle of her street, she froze. The grocery bag slipped from her hands, and several oranges rolled onto the sidewalk, stopping at his feet. Time seemed to freeze in that moment. The oranges, a vibrant orange against the grey asphalt, were the only things with colour and movement in a scene paralyzed by shock. For Clara, seeing Richard there, on her street, was a mirage, a collision of two universes that should never have touched. The man who inhabited a luxury penthouse, whose net worth was greater than the GDP of small countries, was standing in front of her simple house, looking as out of place as a rare orchid growing in a crack in the pavement. It was he who broke the spell. Richard took a step forward and, without hesitation, crouched down. The fabric of his designer slacks touched the grimy ground as he, with the hands that signed multi-million-dollar contracts, began to pick up the oranges, one by one. The gesture of humility was so unexpected, so contrary to the image of the man who had coldly fired her, that it dismantled the armor of anger Clara had built around her heart. He stood up and held the bag out to her. Their eyes met, and for the first time, she saw not the billionaire or the boss, but just a man burdened by a palpable regret. "Clara, he began, his voice hoarse. "I am so sorry. There's no other way to say it. What I did was unforgivable. I was a coward. I let the pressure, the opinion of shallow people, the fear of losing a status that means nothing, I let all of that speak louder." He paused, taking a deep breath, as if the words cost him a physical effort. "I turned you into a problem to be solved, a liability on my balance sheet, and in doing so, I destroyed the greatest asset my home had." His words were both a balm and a poison. Hearing the confession soothed part of her pain, but it also reminded her of the depth of the wound. "You made me feel disposable," she said, her voice a trembling whisper, "as if my affection for your son was just a service, with a price you could pay and dismiss when it was no longer convenient." "I know," he said, his face contorted in a mask of pain. "And I will live with that shame forever, but I'm not here for me, I'm here for Leo." At that moment, Richard's demeanor changed. Shame gave way to a paternal desperation that was impossible to ignore. He doesn't talk anymore. "Clara, he's gone back into the silence. He tore up the drawing you were making, and now he spends his days looking at the pieces. He doesn't eat, he doesn't smile. The house is a tomb again, and all my fortune, all the gold and investments I have, can't buy a single sound from his voice." The image of Leo, alone with the pieces of paper, hit Clara with the force of a punch. The anger she felt toward Richard dissolved, replaced by an overwhelming wave of love and concern for the boy. The tears she had held back for weeks finally welled in her eyes. She could hate what this man had done, but she couldn't abandon the child she had learned to love as if he were her own. Richard saw the change in her face and clung to that spark of hope. "Please, come back," he pleaded, the voice that commanded boardrooms now reduced to a supplication. "I'll pay you whatever you ask. Double, triple. Anything, just help my son." Clara wiped a tear with the back of her hand. She looked at his luxury car, a symbol of a world of power and money that had nearly crushed her. Then she looked at her own home, a place of simplicity, but of true affection. "It's not about your money, Richard," she said, her voice finding its firmness again. It never was. He waited, his breath held, understanding that her decision would not be based on any financial logic he knew. She faced him, her eyes still wet but with a new resolution. "I'll go see Leo, now, but on one condition." Richard's heart hammered in his chest. He would agree to anything. He would sell stocks, liquidate funds, give up part of his inheritance if necessary. "Anything," he said, his voice thick with an urgency that confirmed his desperation. Clara looked at him, and for the first time, he noticed the immense strength that lay behind her fragile appearance. She was no longer the frightened young woman who had walked through his gates weeks ago. Pain had transformed her. "My condition is this," she began, her voice clear and firm, with no room for negotiation. "I will no longer be your employee. There will be no salary, no contract, no fixed hours. If I come back to that house, it will be as Leo's friend. I will come when I can, and I will stay as long as I feel is necessary. And you will not have the right to give me orders or to dismiss me when things become uncomfortable for your world." The proposal was a direct blow to the center of Richard's universe. Everything in his life was governed by contracts, by financial transactions, by clear power dynamics. The idea of having Clara in his house, in his life, in such an undefined, so uncontrollable capacity, was terrifying. It was an investment with no guarantees, with an unpredictable return. But he looked into her eyes and saw there was no other way. He nodded slowly. "I accept." The drive back to the Upper East Side was silent, but the air inside the car was charged with a palpable electricity. When they arrived, the penthouse seemed even colder and more oppressive than Richard remembered. Fatima met them at the door, her eyes filling with tears upon seeing Clara. "Thank God, child," the cook whispered, hugging her tightly. Clara found Leo in his room, exactly as Richard had described. He was sitting on the floor, the pieces of the drawing spread out before him. When he saw her standing in the doorway, his small body stiffened, his eyes widened, a mixture of disbelief, hope, and fear. Clara said nothing. She knelt slowly on the rug at a respectful distance and took something from her bag. It was a small tube of glue and a thin brush. She opened the tube and squeezed a little glue onto a small dish she had brought. Then she picked up 2 torn pieces of the drawing and, with infinite delicacy, joined the edges, like an art restorer mending a masterpiece. Leo watched her every move, his breath held. She didn't press him, didn't call to him. She just continued her patient work, joining the fragments, reconstructing his mother's smile, piece by piece. After a few minutes, he crawled across the rug, moving closer. He stretched out his small, trembling hand and picked up one of the pieces of paper. He looked at her, seeking permission. Clara smiled, a small, encouraging smile. "We can fix it together," she said, her voice as soft as a lullaby. "Not everything that breaks has to stay broken forever. Sometimes the cracks can remind us of how strong we were." Richard watched the scene from the half-open door, his heart tight in his chest, a mixture of pain and admiration. He was a silent witness to a miracle his money couldn't buy. He saw his son take the brush with his clumsy hand and dab a little glue on the edge of a piece of paper. He saw the concentration on his little face, the effort to join the torn parts. It was more than fixing a drawing, it was an act of healing. They stayed there for almost an hour, in a collaborative silence, piecing it all together. When the last fragment was glued in place, Leo ran his fingers over the seams. His mother's face was whole again, but crisscrossed with paper scars, like a map of his journey of pain and reunion. He held up the drawing, gripping it with both hands, and looked at Richard, who was still in the doorway. And then, the second miracle happened. The word Richard had been waiting to hear since the day his wife was gone, the word he thought he would never hear again, came from his son's lips. Faint, hesitant, but perfectly clear. "Dad." The sound, so simple and so profound, shattered the final barrier of ice around Richard's heart. He dropped to his knees, the tears he had suppressed for years finally rolling freely down his face. Time seemed to stop. Clara, sensing this was a sacred moment between father and son, began to stand up to leave discreetly, but through his tears, Richard reached out and grabbed her hand, a desperate gesture to keep her from disappearing again. Richard's hand holding hers was not the hand of an employer, but that of a drowning man clinging to the only available lifeline. Clara felt the tremor that ran through him, the raw vulnerability of a multimillionaire who, in that instant, possessed nothing but this fragile moment. She stopped, her instinct to pull away overcome by the silent force of his plea. Leo, with the mended drawing still in his hands, watched them both, his small head tilted, understanding not the words, but the current of emotion that connected them. Richard's crying subsided, turning into quiet sobs. He finally let her go, embarrassed, and wiped his face with the back of his hand. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice thick. She just shook her head, a gesture that said there was nothing to be sorry for. That moment was the true signing of the new contract between them, an agreement not written on paper, but etched in their hearts. The months that followed were a slow, careful reconstruction. Clara became a constant presence, not as a shadow following orders, but as a light that filled the dark corners of the house. She brought with her the smell of freshly baked banana bread, the sound of songs that spoke of hope, and the patience of someone who understands that healing doesn't happen overnight. Richard, for his part, began to shed the man he had been. He started delegating important meetings, trusting his managers to monitor the cash flow of his businesses, and understanding that the most important return wasn't on the stock market charts, but in the smile that was blooming again on his son's face. His most valuable assets were no longer real estate or gold investments. It was the sound of Leo's laughter echoing down the hall. The attraction between him and Clara grew in silence, in small gestures, in the cup of tea he brought her late in the afternoon, in the way she straightened his collar before a meeting, in the glances that lingered a second longer than necessary. It was an intimacy built on the ruins of a great pain, and for that very reason, it was solid and true. The greatest proof of the transformation came from Leo. With Clara's support, he not only started talking again, but began to express himself in ways that surprised everyone. His drawings became more colorful, bolder. The mended portrait of his mother was framed and placed in the living room, a symbol that scars could indeed be part of beauty. It was then that the idea came. Leo's school was holding its annual art exhibition. Richard saw an opportunity not to show off his son, but to celebrate his journey. "Leo, what do you think about showing your drawing of Mommy at the school exhibition?" he asked one evening, his heart anxious. Leo's eyes lit up. The idea of sharing his work, his story, filled him with a shy pride. In the following days, preparing for the event became the project of this small, unlikely family. They worked together, painting the frame with gold paint, right over the lines where the paper had been glued. However, the outside world, which they had managed to keep at a distance, was about to come knocking. 2 days before the exhibition, Richard's phone rang. It was Mrs. Vance, the headmistress. Her voice was syrupy sweet, but laced with a subtle venom. "Mr. Hayes, how wonderful that Leo will be participating. We are all so thrilled with his progress." She took a calculated pause. "Just a small administrative matter. We've been informed that your former nanny has been frequenting your home again. You understand, to maintain the harmony and image of our institution, and for the comfort of the other families, it would be inappropriate for her to attend the event. You do understand, don't you?" The silence on the line was heavy. Richard looked through the glass door of his office. He saw Clara and Leo on the rug, laughing as they cleaned a smudge of gold paint off the boy's nose. He was at the exact same crossroads as before, with the same choice to make. On one side, the world he knew, with its rules, its status, and its demands. On the other, the woman who had taught his son, and him, how to draw again. Mrs. Vance was waiting for an answer, and for the second time, all of their futures depended on a single decision from Richard. Richard gripped the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. Mrs. Vance's ultimatum was a repeat of the nightmare, a final test for the man he was becoming. He heard Leo's laugh from the living room, a sound that had become more valuable to him than his entire fortune in euros and cryptocurrency. In that sound lay his answer. He brought the phone back to his ear, the calmness in his voice surprising even himself. "Mrs. Vance," he began, his tone polite, but with an unbreakable steel thread. "I understand perfectly. I understand that the image of your institution is more important than the well-being of a child. I understand that you are running a social club, not a nurturing environment." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Clara is not just the former nanny. She is the person who saved my son. She is part of my family. And if she is not welcome at your event, then neither are we. Mr. Hayes, there's no need to take such drastic measures." The headmistress began to stammer, caught off guard by his firmness. "On the contrary, there is every need." He cut her off. "Consider Leo's enrollment terminated at the end of this semester. We will be looking for an institution that values character over capital. Have a good day, Eleanor." He hung up before she could reply. A wave of relief and freedom washed over him. For the first time, he had chosen his heart over his business, love over image. He walked out of the office and knelt beside Clara and Leo on the rug. "Everything okay?" she asked, noticing the intensity in his eyes. "Everything is perfect," he replied, and he smiled. A genuine smile. "Without the shadows of worry, we have an exhibition to get to." The night of the exhibition arrived. The school hall was crowded, a sea of wealthy, well-dressed faces. When Richard walked in, holding Leo's hand, with Clara by his side, an awkward silence fell over the room. The whispers started, glances were exchanged. Mrs. Vance watched them from a distance, her face a mask of disapproval. But Richard didn't care. He held his head high, his gaze focused on his son. Leo's drawing, with its golden cracks, was displayed in a prominent spot. Beneath it, a small plaque read, "My Mum's Face," by Leo, mended with the help of my dad and my Auntie Clara. The simplicity and honesty of those words cut deeper than any gossip. When the awards were announced, Leo's name was called. He won the Award of Merit for Emotional Expression. Shyly, he walked up to the small stage. Richard and Clara followed, one on each side. The boy took the microphone, his small hands trembling. He looked at his drawing, then at the audience. "My mom taught me how to smile," he said, his voice small but clear. "My dad taught me how to be strong, and my Auntie Clara, she taught me how to draw again when I was broken." He then did something no one expected. He took Richard's hand and Clara's hand and joined them together. The audience, which minutes before had been whispering maliciously, erupted in spontaneous, emotional applause. The truth of that moment was undeniable and more powerful than any rumor. Mrs. Vance, in the corner, was forced to clap, the strained smile on her face, the picture of her defeat. On that stage, under the lights, stood not the billionaire, the poor nanny, and the child with paralysis. There stood a family, bound not by blood, but by the golden scars they had mended together. As they left the event, the night was full of stars. Richard pulled the car over at a lookout point with a view of the city. He turned to Clara, the glow of the New York skyline reflected in her eyes. "Clara," he said, his voice full of an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Leo wasn't the only one you taught how to draw again. You taught me how to live again." He took her hand, the same hand that had guided his son's. "And I know your place isn't as my employee, but I hope from the bottom of my soul that your place is by my side." Clara looked into the back seat, where Leo was sleeping, a serene smile on his face. She looked at the man before her, whose wealth was no longer measured in currency, but in courage and love, and she knew that her answer, just like their journey, needed no words. She simply squeezed his hand, a gesture that sealed the end of a chapter of pain and the beginning of a future of hope. The Upper East Side penthouse was no longer a space defined by cold marble and the echo of loneliness. The luxury architecture remained, but it now served as a canvas for a vibrant life. The smell of fresh coffee and banana bread, which Fatima now baked with a constant smile, mingled with the soft scent of paint and crayons. The walls, once bare and imposing, were a constantly changing art gallery, displaying Leo's colorful drawings. The classical music that was once Clara's act of rebellion was now the official soundtrack of their mornings. The house, once a balance sheet of losses and emotional liabilities, was finally operating with a positive cash flow of affection. Life found a new rhythm, a routine of simple happiness. Richard, the man who once lived chained to the financial market's clock, now measured his time differently, by the stories read before bed, by Saturday afternoons in Central Park, by Leo's progress in his swimming lessons. He discovered that the greatest dividend a man can receive is the trust in his son's eyes. Clara, in turn, found her place. With Richard's unconditional encouragement and support, she returned to college to finish her degree in early childhood education, not as a distant dream, but as a reality. She was no longer the nanny, nor the employee. She was the rock upon which this new family had been rebuilt, the architect of their happiness. The mended drawing, with its golden scars, was given a place of honor in the main living room, just above the piano that had belonged to Richard's wife and was now being played again, not with melancholy, but with the joy of the lessons Clara and Leo took together. The painting became a beacon, a constant reminder that what was broken can become even stronger and more beautiful in its restoration. Inspired by his son's journey, Richard used his vast network and his capital not to acquire more assets, but to create something of lasting value. He founded an institute, an inclusive art project for children with motor and expressive difficulties, in partnership with Leo's new, welcoming school. The initiative's profit wasn't measured in dollars or euros, but in the number of smiles he saw on the faces of children who, like his son, just needed someone to hold their hand and tell them they could keep on drawing. On a Sunday afternoon, the three of them were sitting on the living room rug, not far from where Clara had first guided Leo's hand. They weren't doing anything special. They were just together, assembling a jigsaw puzzle. The sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, and Richard looked at Clara. She was laughing at a funny face Leo had made, her own face lit with pure joy. In that moment, he understood the deepest truth of all. True wealth wasn't in hoarding a fortune to protect yourself from the world, but in having the courage to open yourself up to it, to let someone in to help you glue the pieces back together. Love doesn't fix people. It gives them the tools and the courage to fix themselves, stroke by stroke, until the heart finally can move freely again.